Hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of What's the Move. I apologize for the short break, but I am back and ready to do my first episode that's a request. This request comes from Reddit user Molasan, who asked me to step through some early game decisions, one that might not necessarily determine the outcome of the entire game, but these early game decisions are very important nonetheless, and sometimes they can feel quite vague. We use a totally different set of heuristics when making early game decisions than we do with late game decisions. Often we're working with a lot less complete information, which means that there's a bit more guesswork going into what we have to do in the early game. So let's jump into our situation here. It's our turn 3, and we have quite a few options. So far, the only piece of information that we have to work with is that our opponent played a Hydrologist on turn 2, and then on turn 3 elected not to play the Secret with their leftover mana. Our opponent could really be on anything, as Hydrologist is played in everything from Aggro Paladin to Control Paladin, so we don't have a ton of information to work with there. The cards that we're able to play from our hand are Frostbolt, Doomsayer, Medivh's Valet, Ice Barrier, and Ice Block. So, what's the move?
Moves quickly. I wonder.
I opted for Ice Block, Attack Face. A pretty straightforward decision that I expect most of you at home will have arrived to yourself. But the key thing here is not the destination, it is the journey. How did we arrive to this decision? And what is the framework that I use for guiding these kinds of early game decisions? So in early game situations like this one, particularly when I'm playing a control deck, the first thing I like to ask myself is, what's the scariest thing my opponent can do next turn? And just try to run down a list of all the potential plays that they could make. Now at this point, we can't be positive what kind of deck they're running, but the fact that it's turn 4 and they're a paladin really narrows down our number of choices to something that's pretty manageable. So we can start off this whole process, I think, by ruling out plays from Hand Buff and Aggro Paladin. Our opponent played a Hydrologist on turn 2, which means they aren't running Prince Keleseth, which is kind of a linchpin in those decks. The deck that they're most likely to be playing is a Murloc or mid-range Paladin deck. That's about 75% of the Paladins that I see on ladder. But they could also be running a Control Paladin, given what we've seen so far. So I think that we really only need to worry about plays from these two decks because the likelihood our opponent is on something else is just quite low. So there's really only so many plays that can come out of a mid-range or Control Paladin on turn 4, so it should be pretty easy to step through all of them. Let's try to do that. The strongest plays out of Control Paladin are Corpse Taker and True Silver Champion, while the strongest plays out of mid-range Paladin are Corpse Taker again, Blessing of Kings, Righteous Protector into Rallying Blade, and Murloc into Rockpool Hunter. Given that our opponent elected to hold on to their secret, it's pretty likely that they chose either Redemption or Getaway Kodo, so this means that they could also be looking to play one of those secrets in combination with a taunt minion like Wicker Flame Burn Bristle, Stonehill Defender, or Tar Creeper. That's really it. These are really the only plays that I'm worrying about right now. Though our opponent is certainly capable of making other plays than the ones I've mentioned. Cards like, Gentle Megasaur or Spellbreaker are just so suboptimal in this situation that we really don't need to waste our time considering how to play around these cards. So now that we've identified all the scariest things that can happen to us, we should go down a list of all these plays and look for disasters. What we want to be looking for is situations where things just go totally off the rails, and see what we can do to try to avoid those disasters from happening in the first place. After we've done that, if we have time, we can kind of run back over things and look for situations that are the opposite of disasters, things that look really, really good for us, and try to find ways that we can maximize the likelihood of that happening. I like to look for these disaster scenarios first because I personally find it much more challenging to identify scenarios where things go really wrong and ways to play around those than I do to find scenarios where things go really right and construct ways to do that. So it's more for time efficiency than anything else. So let's just run down all these plays as quickly as we can and look for disaster scenarios and see what we can do to try to avoid them. First we have Corpse Taker. Are there any disaster scenarios involving this card? No, I don't really see any. We can always just ping and Frostbolt at next turn, or we can play Ice Block this turn and have ping Medivh's Valet next turn, which is even better. How about True Silver Champion? Any disasters here? Only if we play a Medivh's Valet this turn, so I guess let's just try to avoid playing Medivh's Valet this turn. How about Blessing of Kings? Well, not really here either. We can do nothing this turn and still have Frostbolt plus an Arcanologist attack to kill it the turn after that. We take 5 damage that way, but I'm pretty okay with that. I'd much rather our opponent use their Blessing of Kings on this Silverhand recruit than on something like a Corpse Taker or a Righteous Protector or a Wicker Flame Burn Bristle somewhere down the line, because we're really equipped to beat a 5/5 next turn, but we may not be equipped to kill a 5/5 or a 6/6 with Divine Shield in future turns, so we really don't need to waste any more time worrying about this line right now. Next we have Righteous Protector plus Rallying Blade, which is a bit more awkward for us than the Blessing of Kings is. We'd rather not have to waste a Frostbolt on a Righteous Protector, so if we're pretty concerned about this line, then we probably want to play a secret this turn to set up our Medivh's Valet. I wouldn't quite call this a disaster, but this would certainly be a pretty unfavorable scenario if we didn't play our Ice Block. Next we have the double Murloc line. This is our first true disaster scenario that can crop up, because if we don't play a secret this turn, then we won't be able to clear both minions with Frostbolt plus Medivh's Valet on the following turn, which could potentially set our opponent up for a really strong Gentle Megasaur play on turn 5, especially if they have another 1-drop Murloc somewhere in their hand. We'll never be able to clear Vilephin Inquisitor plus Rockpool Hunter next turn, but at least we could freeze the Inquisitor to prevent it from attacking us on the Megasaur turn on turn 5, and they would also have to draw it this turn because they likely would have played an Inquisitor last turn. So this just leaves us with the 3-drop plus secret lines. Again, things look pretty ugly for us here if we don't set up Medivh's Valet with a secret, because it would really suck to waste a Frostbolt on something which is just going to come back into play after a Getaway Kodo or a Redemption trigger. So again, to avoid disaster, we really want to be playing a secret. So when we look at things from this perspective, how can we prevent things from going wrong? Really all signs point to Ice Block. Barrier, of course, could potentially get popped by any number of cards, and there's really no reason to play Frostbolt, because we want to save that for something much more threatening in the future. And Doomsayer just doesn't really prevent our opponent from doing anything meaningful this turn. So that's how we're going to spend our mana. Just after this first step already, I think it's pretty clear that we want to be playing Ice Block this turn. So this just leaves us with really one more decision for the rest of this turn. Do we attack face, or do we attack the 1/1? Looking back down our list of plays, there's really no disaster scenarios that happen with either decision that we make. So here we just want to be looking for the most upside on the plays that we have. In the vast majority of scenarios, our opponent is just going to attack his 1/1 into our 2/1, but there are a couple of scenarios. The scenario where our opponent plays a Blessing of Kings and the one where they play Righteous Protector into Rallying Blade. But the downside of not attacking the 1/1 in both of these scenarios is pretty small, and the upside of getting 2 damage, in my opinion, was higher, so that's the line I decided to go with. This is purely a judgment call, and I think you can make the case to go either way, but it ends up paying off for me in this particular scenario that I attacked face, because he just does trade the 1/1 into the 2/1 next turn. And that's really it. That's my whole thought process for breaking down early game plays and decisions like this one. It takes many minutes to break down when I'm explaining it, thoroughly in a video like this, but over time and with practice, your intuition really kicks in and you get a feel for different matchups pretty intuitively. So this whole decision-making process really only took me about 10 or 15 seconds when I was in the actual game. So just to recap, the first thing that I do in early game scenarios is use the information that I have, such as my opponent's class and the cards I've played and the knowledge about the current metagame, and work all that together to narrow down the number of potential plays that my opponent can make next turn. Next, I will run down all of those plays and look for disaster scenarios, and see which plays I can make right now to avoid those disasters. Look for patterns within that. After I've done that, I'll run back down the same list, but instead of looking for disasters, I'll look for very favorable scenarios, and try to identify patterns or plays I make right now that generally lead to more favorable scenarios in the future. Finally, if all things are equal and you have multiple plays that you're looking at which seem to be roughly equitable, try to make the play that spends the most mana right now, because ideally, if you spend more mana now, this will free you up to make better use of your mana in the future. And that's it. If you guys have any other requests for future episodes of What's the Move, or would even like to submit your own plays so that I analyze them for the next episode of What's the Move, please feel free to reach out to me via Twitter. I am at Aleco_P, and the following for this show is still small enough that I will definitely be able to read and respond to all the questions and comments and suggestions that I get over there. I'm looking forward to reading your comments, and I will see you guys next week.